Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of the ideas of the European Environment Agency on the topic of moving towards a non-toxic environment. And actually the motivation of doing that is in the title of it. How could you not want to move from a toxic environment to a non-toxic environment? It sounds self-evident. It's a bit daunting to speak to an expert audience, so I will stick to the framing of these issues and how they belong, we think, in a more broader perspective on environmental pressures, chemicals, human health, and where we need to go on this little blue planet. For those of you who do not know the agency very well, we're a European institution based here in Copenhagen on Kongens Nytorv, where we work with 39 European countries. And the essence of what we do is we support European environmental policymakers, both at the level of the EU institutions, primarily DG Environment, DG Klima in Brussels, but a number of others as well, but also at the level of the member states. We work intensely together with a network of about 350 institutions across Europe to build a solid knowledge base. And this knowledge base is also connected to the broader issue of what the environment means in the framing of long-term objectives in Europe. And those are, in our field, embedded in the vision of the 7th Environment Action Programme, which is the guiding document for the European institutions on environment and climate policies. And the title of it is, by 2050, we will live well within the limits of the planet. And so an essential question is, what is the role of chemicals in this living well, but also in these limits of the planet? And the three core orientations for the EU institutions to move towards that vision is that we should move from a linear to a circular model of economy, the Circular Economy Package of December 2015, in which we have an embedded vision on chemicals, that is obvious. Secondly, we need to go from high carbon to low carbon. What is the role of chemicals in this energy transition? Because that is essentially what we are talking about. And also we need to protect natural capital and biodiversity instead of continuing to degrade and deplete it. So again there, chemicals play an essential role in what we now in modern language call ecosystem resilience. So in that sense, there is the framing within the institutions of what you are talking about as experts today. Now, the key question, I think, from a societal and political perspective is how much risk are we willing to accept from chemicals in our society? And that's actually a hugely complex question to answer. Because first of all, we need to understand what risk is. Yeah? And the approach that we are taking is that it is a function of hazard, where we take toxicity as the starting point, and toxicity then is linked to how we use chemicals and how they are present in water, in air. Yesterday we released our annual air quality report for Europe. Our modeled estimates are that 477,000 people a year in Europe die prematurely from air quality issues in Europe. So this is serious issues, but also in food and packaging, consumer products, pharmaceuticals, soil. Chemicals are indeed everywhere, and they're part of our society, that is clear. So what is the toxicity and the risk? It's a complicated thing to analyze. There are several methods to do that embedded in EU legislation and approaches. And then, of course, exposure. And exposure, in essence, means that it is related to where you live, how you go from point A to B, what you eat, how you dress, what type of products you want in your house, and also, and I think this is an important societal and political dimension, what knowledge do you have and what information that can assist you in making choices. And I think this is a rather essential component that we should not lose out of sight. Now, within the current risk paradigm, which is then a function of hazard and exposure in Europe, the emphasis has been on single chemicals and on a sort of fixed dose and its impact on environment or on human health. We think that in line with the ambitions of Europe to move towards a non-toxic environment, we will need to make a shift in the chemicals paradigm and in the risk paradigm that we have in Europe. And here are some of the key elements that we think are essential. First of all, we need to go from a single exposure to a combined exposure thinking, and the minister also alluded to that. This is more easily said than done, because it's a rather radical shift from what we have been doing under the current regime, which is based in REACH, and I think it's fair to say that REACH is probably the best, most integrated, most ambitious chemical legislation on the planet today. It's also embedded in EFSA, Food Safety Authority, with its specific approach. It's embedded in what we do in the Environment Agency. It's embedded in the Water Framework Directive, in all sorts of policies, but it's not based on this new understanding of combined exposure today. We also need to reflect on the expansion of the notion of harm. If you think of some chemicals, we based our knowledge in a first instance, or I should better say your knowledge as the expert community, on neurotoxic impacts. But we now know that also behavioral disorders can be linked to chemical exposure, toxic immune system and reproduction issues. In my more simple language, being not an ecotoxicologist or a chemist, we talk about carcinogenic impacts, mutagenic impacts, obesogenic impacts. Some people start to link it to dementia, and other impacts, reproductive system. It's everywhere. How do we understand this combined dose exposure across the lifetime, going from the prenatal to the old age, and what it does to human beings? This is the new understanding that we are working on. If we want to do that, the governance of chemicals and chemicals knowledge, and the governance of how we deal throughout the economic cycle and in social terms with chemicals, will have to go through a serious transition. And this is needed not only in Europe. It has a strong global dimension, as you all probably know. We know that the use of chemicals and the production of chemicals is increasing, primarily in developing and emerging countries, but all across the planet. And the impacts are also planetary to a certain extent. And if you look at the hazard and we don't change this, which is the essential characteristics of the chemicals, but we increase the exposure, the simple conclusion is that the risk is increasing of the use of chemicals on this one planet that we have. And so we should reflect on what it means for human health, but also in terms of resilience of ecosystems, which is the second half of the European policy plan within the limits of the planet. So it has an impact directly and indirectly. That was the global perspective. Now, what if we look at the EU production of toxic chemicals, and these are Eurostat data of this year. The estimate is that about 30% is non-hazardous. And when I saw this graph for the first time, I have to say I was a bit shocked, because it means that almost 2/3 of them are recognized as hazardous to health. And if you look at some of the colors, if you go to the reddish color, it's a carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic health hazard. These are no small issues. If you look at the green, chronic toxic health hazard, and the purple, very toxic health hazard. And this is based on what we know today. And I think it's fair to say that in the chemicals field, there is quite a bit of unknown, not only on individual chemicals, but also on combined exposure over longer time periods. So serious issues that we have. Now, I think one of the objectives of a toxic-free transition and of working with the chemical sector is to make chemicals benign by design, which means that we would have to move to a different type of chemistry, whether you call it bio-based chemistry or green chemistry, that doesn't really matter. The essence is that you move away from a type of chemicals that have characteristics that we know to be toxic to a type of chemicals that are non-toxic or at least less toxic, and on top of that, in line with carbon reduction that we aim for and that allow the chemicals to stay in a circular economy perspective. In terms of chemical pollution and disease, very briefly, by now, pollution risk factors outweigh some of the known big factors in diseases when it comes to human health, like HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, cancer. If you look at pollution, this is a very heavy factor in global healthcare. And in fact, if you look at the World Health Organization's recent work, the emphasis is really on this type of exposure and risk understanding of health issues. The 70AP talks about a strategy for a non-toxic environment. The topics considered in this strategy will be presented to you by the colleagues from European institutions. We've got the Commission here, we've got EFSA here, we've got ECHA here. They are much better equipped than myself to explain in more detail what this means. But it's clear that the topics considered actually do address the key issues that I brought to the table. Substitution that needs to be done in a way that actually addresses the issue and not just taking a chemical from the same group, because you will probably end up with the same issues. Non-toxic products and clean material cycles. This is this transition to a different type of production and consumption of chemicals. Attention for vulnerable groups. This is very important. You know, people with fragile health, early age, older age people. Persistent chemicals, which are of course a problem of their own because they build up and may lead to irreversible issues. And then a number of other things related more to the governance, going from policy means innovation and competitiveness, R&D, but also early warnings. And this is where I, in shameful self-promotion, would like to flag up some of the key work that is done by the agency on risk, uncertainty, and the precautionary principle, late lessons from early warnings, where scientists have said, guys, we think we have a problem here, you should pay attention to this. And the conclusion, based on more than 30 case studies, is that they are nearly always right. And waiting causes more harm and is more costly to clean up. If it is cleanable at all, that's not an English word, but you know what I mean. So the book is freely available right there on the table. So they should go like hotcakes. Okay, good. Like, yeah. Anyway, I'm nearing the end here. Chemicals, I mean the end of my presentation, of course, not the... chemicals in the circular economy, very important, because if you don't have a solid approach to chemicals, it becomes rather tricky to make the statement that you want to keep materials and value, economic value, in your cycle, because you could have the build-up in renewed use of materials, of chemicals, and you could increase the sort of base load of chemicals in products. You need legislation on what is waste and what is a material. I mean, this is a rather tricky issue, but we think it's important in terms of producer responsibility and the development of that concept in circular economy and chemicals. Product longevity, and this is a tricky issue because some chemicals contribute to product longevity, but they might be toxic, so this is a trade-off. Yeah. Multiple cycles and the implications of keeping chemicals in that cycle, but also loss of resources and materials and where they then go, because in the end you will still have some emissions and some waste and what you do with it in the circular economy. In essence, we think that we need a transitional paradigm. The modeling in the margins will no longer do for Europe's environment and climate objective, and it will no longer do for chemicals either. So what we need is not a stepwise slow improvement in risk. What we need is a systemic change where we go to a different system of producing chemicals in line with overall environmental, climate and health objectives in Europe, where we rethink production and consumption systems, but also the engagement of citizens and their understanding of this, if we really want to move to a sustainable system of using chemicals in our whole economy. This will require legislation, it will require market approaches, it will require responsibility on the side of producers, it will require involving citizens, it will require research and innovation that is rather fundamental and not in the margins. It's a systemic approach to moving from a toxic chemical environment to a non-toxic chemical environment. Conclusions? We think that the further integration of understanding of how chemicals operate in this broader agenda is essential. We also think that we need to better understand the risks on human health and the environment in an integrated, more systemic approach on top of the more pointed single item approaches. We think that the circular economy package offers a great opportunity to really tackle this issue in a more fundamental way. But then, and I want to end with that, the evidence and the narratives on this, we think, are absolutely crucial. If you want to engage your society in this debate and not keep this in the chemical bubble as a discussion, we need to find a language that allows us to have a societal debate about this. And that is not a debate in micrograms and ppms, because nobody speaks that language except for you. So this is rather essential. We also need a much more appropriate system of understanding these multiple impacts on the human body over longer periods of time at a European level. This is the Human Biomonitoring for Europe project, where the agency will play a role in translating knowledge to policymakers, but also in justice and costs as drivers of results. And this injustice part is important because we know that in terms of exposure and risk, this is not evenly spread over the population. In the US, they have a very strong legislation on environmental justice. The question in the European framing is, where do we stand when it comes to environmental justice, chemicals, and risks to the environment and to human health? As an agency, we try to contribute to this debate from an environmental and systemic perspective, and we look forward to working with the scientific community, but also, of course, with the colleagues in the EU on coming to a combined better understanding in support of more future-oriented policies. Thank you very much.